This presentation is the second part of Lecture 2, which focuses on communicating identity. In this particular lecture, I'm going to focus primarily on a theory called politeness theory. And I will say that this is the theory that I probably get the most questions about when it comes to exam review time. And I think it's just because there are a number of different lists involved with the theory. So I've tried to simplify it a bit this semester, and hopefully it'll be a bit more clear and more tangible. We're also going to use politeness theory to understand cell phone use in close relationships. So there's a recommended reading available on Husky CT to supplement that part of the discussion. All right, so let's start with an example. So let's say that you're a student in a college course and you simply did not manage your time effectively and you are in desperate need of a deadline extension on an assignment. I know this probably does not sound relatable at all to any of you. You know the course policy is no extensions, we'll just say in this example. But if you get a 0 on this assignment, you also know that you're in danger of failing the course. So you decide to ask the instructor for an extension. My question to you is, how do you go about doing that? So think about that for a minute. How would you go about asking for an extension under the best possible circumstances? What are your considerations in determining how to ask for that extension? I've come up with a list of things that I have heard from students who make such a request, right? So you're thinking about your own course grade, your overall GPA. You're also probably thinking about your self-image, right? And how you want your instructor to think about you. And you might also consider your track record and the content and valence of previous interactions that you've had with this particular instructor, among other things. I'm sure there are other things that I haven't listed here. You might also consider the instructor's impression of you, right? So, what do they think about you if you do have this track record, if you have had previous interactions with this person? And then, along with that, you might consider things like um, to what extent do you respect the instructor's time and policies? And would such a request be perceived as potentially disrespectful? Or how can you make the request in a way that still communicates respect for the professor, but you can still maybe get the answer that you're looking for? And then on the other hand, on the other side of that, so you're mostly those questions were all related to how you're thinking about yourself and how you want to be perceived. What do you think in terms of the professor's considerations might be in determining their response to you? And finally, what happens if the professor says no? What's your next step? Is there a next step? Do you just accept the situation as is? Or do you try again and use a different tactic? So I set the stage here for you because politeness theory deals with a number of these considerations in this example. So if you can kind of keep that example in the back of your head as we talk through the content here, I think that'll be a good place to start making sense of the theory itself. So without further ado, let's get right into politeness theory. I've got 3 questions for you that'll help you kind of think about what politeness theory really is getting at. So first, think about the word polite or the word politeness. What does it mean? And maybe your definition differs from someone else's, but what does it mean to be polite? And what are some examples of being polite? So you might think about things related to being respectful, being considerate, using your manners, right? Engaging in all the rules of etiquette and appropriateness. Politeness can be communicated verbally and it can be communicated non-verbally. So when you say please and thank you, you're using verbal forms of politeness. When you help somebody out, right? When you give up your seat maybe in a crowded room for someone who is older than you, or maybe a woman who is pregnant or something like that, right? You give your seat to that person out of politeness. You hold the door for someone. Those are all nonverbal behaviors to show consideration toward another person. My second question is, what are some of the positive outcomes of being polite? And also, what are some of the negative outcomes of being polite? Because I think we know that there aren't, like, this isn't just a one sided situation here. So, on the one hand, when you're polite, you probably feel good about doing something nice for someone. When you're polite, others might notice that behavior and appreciate it. People are going to think you're a good person. So, those are all some positive outcomes of showing politeness. But unfortunately, if politeness goes too far, you might be perceived as a pushover or someone people can take advantage of. You might also become burdened depending on the situation and the behavior that you are enacting. And importantly, you might be doing something that you don't really want to do, right? So maybe you're tired and you're sore and you don't want to give up the seat on that bus, but you do it anyway because you're a nice person. And then finally, what motivates you to be polite? And then what prevents you from being polite? So those positive and negative outcomes we just talked about overlap with what motivates you or prevents you from being polite to some extent. So on the one hand, you like that people like you, right? So being seen as a good person is a good thing. But on the other hand, it can be very frustrating to feel like you can't do or say what you want to do, right? It's frustrating to feel like you lack agency and independence and autonomy. So politeness theory really focuses on this tension between maintaining your positive self-image and doing what you want to do and saying what you want to say without consequence. So we'll get into the specifics here over the next few slides. You've probably heard someone use the phrase saving face before. We often use it to describe situations that are or that could potentially become embarrassing. And we also use it to describe situations where you're trying to achieve your own goals without interfering too much with someone else's goals. So, politeness theory in general focuses on the specific ways people manage and save face using various communication tactics. And there are two types of face needs that are central to this theory. So the first is positive face. So your positive face is that favorable image that you are going to showcase to others, and you hope that those others are going to validate that positive image. So positive face really just reflects your desire to be liked by other people. This is an advertisement here, put your best face forward, for a plastic surgery group. But the idea here is very similar to what we're talking about. In the same way that you can manage your personal physical appearance, hoping to look younger or more beautiful or whatever, you can also manage your self presentation to appear friendlier, smarter, tougher, assertive, and so on. And you again hope that people notice that and validate that image that you are communicating to them. Negative face, on the other hand, is the part of you that really wants to do or say what you want without having to worry about how other people are going to react to you or how other people are going to perceive you. So this reflects your desire to be free from imposition and to have control over your territory, your time, your possessions, and your decision making. Right? So here we've got an individual saying, yeah, I don't want to do that. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just say that to anyone, anytime, right? Or if you could be like Oscar the Grouch and you could tell people to scram. If you could say no to all the things that people ask you to do, or if you could say all the things you're thinking and feeling without having to worry about the consequences, that would be incredible, right? You would probably experience much less frustration, though you may have some interpersonal problems because people generally don't expect us to do those things. And so that's part of the reason you don't do those things, because if you did, people would think that you're mean, that you're rude, that you're grouchy, you're grumpy, you're unreasonable, or you're impolite. And that's something that you probably want to avoid. So we've identified the central constructs of the theory. We have our positive face needs and we have our negative face needs. So let's get into the central assumptions of this theory. First, the theory assumes that everyone experiences a constant struggle between wanting to do what they want to do, so that's prioritizing your negative face, and then wanting to do what makes you look good to other people, that's prioritizing your positive face. And threats to our positive and negative faces are unavoidable in social interactions, and that's why you're experiencing this struggle between the two. In most cases, a behavior will support one of those needs and threaten the other, or fall somewhere between the two face needs. It's very rare that you can satisfy your positive face needs and your negative face needs in the same interaction. So, for example, let's say you drive a truck. And if you do, in fact, drive a truck, you know that part of the responsibility of that is for some reason helping your friends move, right? So your friends are going to ask you if you'd be willing to help them move because you have a truck and that keeps them from having to rent a truck on their own. Now, you probably want to say no because helping someone move is a huge imposition and an inconvenience, and it usually happens on a weekend when you're probably trying to do other things. So it's an imposition, so that request itself threatens your negative face. But you're probably going to say yes because that prioritizes your positive face, right? You want to be a good friend. You believe yourself to be a good friend and a helpful person. So you're going to say yes, even though that's not something that you really would love to do on a Saturday morning, right? Secondly, the theory assumes that your positive and your negative faces can be either validated or threatened by a given interaction. So when your face needs are validated, the behavior and the response to that behavior support your desired image. But when a behavior is different than the identity you want to convey, this is this threatens the positive or the negative face, and we call this a face threatening act. So let's say, for example, that you're on a team and you want to convey your identity as a good teammate by coming to practice early, helping out the rest of your teammates, cheering them on, supporting them, so on and so forth. You would like for them to validate that identity as a good teammate, right? And then maybe they do. So they respond to all of those behaviors by showing appreciation, acknowledging the extra work you put in, maybe even giving you an award um, at the end of the season or something like that, right? So they're validating that particular identity that you're portraying. Face threatening acts detract from the identity you want to portray. So, for example, let's say you unfortunately forget your best friend's birthday. So, this certainly violates your identity as a caring, thoughtful person. This threatens your positive face. And your friend may further contribute to that threat by getting really upset and angry with you and yelling at you or criticizing you, either alone or maybe in public and in front of other people. The third assumption is that we generally try to avoid making ourselves look bad, of course. But we also try to avoid making other people look bad as well. So both people in an interaction are motivated to avoid threatening their own and others' face needs. We generally don't expect that people are going to call us out in most situations, and we probably wouldn't do the same to them. And we try also not to step on others' toes or impose upon them or inconvenience them. Instead, we try to respect their autonomy and their independence and ability to make their own decisions. And finally, the fourth assumption acknowledges the fact that not all behaviors are equally face threatening. Some behaviors cause you to lose more face and lead to more negative personal and relational consequences than others. And there are at least 6 factors that affect how severe we perceive a face threatening act to be. So now we will transition to the next slide where we will cover another list within this particular theory. Face-threatening acts are behaviors that detract from or take away from your identity, and unfortunately often make you look foolish um, in the same breath. So I'll give you a list of the 6 factors that help you to kind of understand the severity of a face-threatening act, and I'll talk through an example of each one as I do that. So first, the more important the rule that is violated, the more severe the face-threatening act is. So for example, telling someone that they are no longer welcome to be a part of your wedding party is worse than telling someone you don't like their partner, which is worse than telling someone you don't like their haircut, right? So you're violating rules at different levels of severity there. Secondly, the more harm the behavior produces, the more severe the face-threatening act is perceived to be. So getting caught telling a very serious lie, for example, is much worse than getting caught telling just a little white lie. Third, the more you as the actor are directly responsible for the behavior that was the face-threatening act, the more severe the face-threatening act is perceived to be. So for example, if you cancel plans because you are legitimately sick, you're not directly responsible for that, probably in most cases. But if you cancel plans because you're extremely hungover, you are directly responsible for that behavior, right? So that's a more severe face-threatening act than just canceling plans because you don't feel well. These 3 items are behaviors that threaten your face as the sender in this transaction. All right, so the fourth factor related to the severity of face-threatening acts is the more of an imposition the behavior is, the more severe the face-threatening act. So asking someone to get your mail while you're out of town is less of an imposition than asking someone to house sit or pet sit while you're gone, right? The 5th factor is the more power the receiver has over the sender, the more severe the face-threatening act. So it is certainly much worse if you make an offensive comment to your boss than your friend, because your boss has more power over you than your friend does. And then finally, the larger the social distance between the sender and the receiver, the more severe the face-threatening act is. There's an asterisk here because there is an argument to be made in the other direction. So first, as this is presented here, an example would be you might be less worried about threatening a friend's face needs versus a classmate's because the relationship with your friend is more solid and can therefore withstand a face-threatening act. So that's an argument in favor of what you see here on the screen. But this may not always be true. So sometimes we worry more about a face-threatening act when it is a close other because the consequences of threatening their face could be more substantial than threatening the face of someone that you're not quite as close to. So it really kind of depends on what the act is in this situation. So these behaviors can threaten your face or your partner's face needs. So this is going to seem like a strange transition here, but we are going to use politeness theory to kind of examine and understand cell phone use in close relationships. So cell phones, we know, are ubiquitous. The use is incredibly widespread. More than 90% of American adults own a cell phone, and many of us feel like we can't survive without them, which, might be bordering on addiction. In terms of relationships, cell phone use can very much be a positive thing, right? So having a cell phone increases frequency of communication, especially when physical presence isn't possible. And mediated communication is particularly important for maintaining long distance relationships because it enhances closeness and relationship satisfaction, right? That's your primary means of communicating with someone if they don't live close to you and you can't see them that often. Owning multiple mobile technologies provides access to larger and more expansive networks and may improve well being. So, cell phones almost always improve relationships when they are used to enhance communication and enhance closeness, right? So, it helps provide social connection, it helps reduce loneliness. And this is all true unless, of course, maintenance expectations become overwhelming, which is entirely possible. So, not responding to a text or a call immediately could potentially communicate disinterest, or threaten opportunities for social bonding, whether you mean to communicate that or not. So, we do to some extent expect people to be constantly available and responsive, given, again, the ubiquitous nature of cell phones. So, cell phone use in relationships is, again, generally positive, but their presence and use with what we call co present others or people in the physical environment creates a face threatening situation, or, in other words, a situation where politeness expectations might be violated. Now, I want to distinguish between presence and usage here. So, unlike cell phone usage, cell phone presence represents those times in which a phone is visibly present and therefore able to convey meaning to other individuals in the area as a nonverbal artifact, if you will, but they're not being used, right? So a phone may be considered present when it's visible on a table, a couch, in your lap, if you're just even just holding it in your hand, as long as it's not being used. So cell phone presence shifts to cell phone use only once you start to actually use the phone, right? So type on your phone or read from your phone, um, like a social media post or an email or something like that. So, a glance at a phone in anticipation of receiving a notification would be considered cell phone presence, but unlocking the device and manipulating the screen is considered cell phone use. So, there are two hypotheses or ideas to disentangle here. The first is called the mere presence hypothesis, which predicts that even the presence of a phone during a face to face interaction can inhibit or create negative outcomes on relational development. And why might that be? Well, the research says that it potentially decreases satisfaction with the conversation among those that find phone presence to be meaningful anyway. It can decrease empathy, right? Because if your phone is present and you're kind of glancing at it every so often, maybe you're missing some nonverbal cues. It negatively impacts nonverbal immediacy, right? So again, that like feeling that the person is attentive to you and willing to engage in conversation. Although this idea has sort of been changing over time. So we are generally speaking getting pretty used to the prevalence of cell phones. But they can cause a distraction because thinking about or anticipating something coming from the phone, it might be enough to, again, decrease your attention to the other person that you're interacting with. Phubbing, on the other hand, is when cell phone presence turns into cell phone use. So, this is the act of snubbing a co present other by focusing on your phone during a face to face conversation. So, this is a combination between phone use and snubbing, which is why we call it phubbing. So, cell phones create competition for attention, and we want to be attentive to the people who are present with us, but we also want to be available to others with whom we have relationships. So there's again sort of this tension between having your phone out and available and using it, while you are also trying to, engage in uh, relationship maintenance behaviors with the person that you're with in the physical environment as well. With that being said, context is important here. Um, so there are some situations where it's more appropriate, more or less appropriate, to use your cell phone than in others. So it's people consider it to be less appropriate when you're like on a first date, obviously. So if you're on a first date, you want to kind of give your attention to the other person because you need to engage in that information seeking, right? You want to reduce your uncertainty about that person. You want to get to know them. So you probably don't want to be on your phone while doing that. Also, just generally eating in a restaurant, romantic partners have identified it that as inappropriate to be on your phone in those situations. Family dinners are a big one. I know in my family, um, the I'll call it the adults were always kind of yelling at the kids, so to speak, to put their phones away. And now that dynamic seems to have flipped. Like my dad is constantly on his cell phone. And my uncle is bad about it as well. And so now my sister and I are the ones like asking them to get off their phones and pay attention to what's happening. Talking and hanging out with friends. Again, we generally don't love it when people are on their phones during those types of situations, so it might depend on um, the characteristics of the social setting. But we tend to be more tolerant whenever we're hanging out at home. So I'm sure you all have this experience, whether it's with a roommate, a family member, or a partner. Um, my husband and I routinely, after we put the kid to bed, we sit down, turn on the TV, and then we scroll on our phones until we basically fall asleep. And so usually we're more tolerant of those kinds of things. And we'd like to send things that we find on social media to other people. So that's called pebbling. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but that can actually increase connection. We're also generally tolerant of people using their phones in social settings. It's a great way to kind of regain your space in a crowded situation, right? So if you're in an elevator, for example, you can make yourself feel like you have more space by looking at your phone or attending to your phone. And then also, we're more tolerant in private situations when our friends and our partners have like shared rules or norms about cell phone use. So let's go back to face threatening acts and those six factors that determine the severity of a face threatening act. So what the first question I would ask related to the first factor is what is the rule about cell phone use in your relationship? So you may have rules and they might be spoken or not. Um, about cell phone use in your various relationships that could dictate the severity of the face threatening act related to cell phone use. Right. So maybe you have a rule about phones at the dinner table or during important conversations. And then how important are those rules? That's going to determine how severe your use of the phone might be. Secondly, is the question related to harm. So, how much harm does the cell phone use cause in your particular situation? Usually, harm comes in the form of annoyance or a distraction, but it may also be perceived as disrespectful or as a lack of consideration for the other person, right? So, for example, if I'm trying to talk to you about something that I find to be really important, and I have told you that this is very important, and then you keep messing with your phone, that's probably more harmful than using your phone while you're hanging out watching TV or something like that. The third factor is like level of responsibility, right? So how responsible is the fubber for their cell phone use in this situation? Now, theoretically, the fubber is highly responsible, but there are important situations or caveats here where um, if something is unfolding on your phone and it requires your attention, that lessens the personal responsibility a bit, right? So if you have a family member who needs to get in contact with you and explain a particular situation, maybe someone is sick or in trouble, you obviously are going to prioritize your need to answer your phone than the person physically in the room with you. So there could be differences in levels of responsibility here. How much of an imposition is the cell phone use, and how much of an imposition would it be to not use the cell phone? So it may or may not be a big deal, again, in casual situations, but it's going to be more bothersome if the conversation is serious and the phone use is interfering and you have to constantly repeat yourself because the other person's not paying attention, right? And then related to that second question, would you be comfortable asking someone to put their phone away? So the imposition question can be related to like the person not phubbing or the person who is actually engaging in the phubbing. Um, if the phubber has more power, moving on to number 5, um, which might increase others' expectations of their ability, they can probably get away with using the phone more than the other way around, right? So your boss can phub you, but you probably should not phub them. And then finally, how close is the relationship between the person phubbing and the other person? So in this situation, the closeness of a relationship might be advantageous unless, again, the conversational topic is serious and you already have rules in place. So these are not factors that exist individually. Some of them may overlap, and you could uh, violate a person's face by violating any 6 of these or any combination of the 6 of these factors. I mentioned that I posted an optional reading for you related to politeness theory or using politeness theory to explain cell phone use in relationships. So I'm going to get into what the researchers found here. So they conducted focus groups where the participants were asked to discuss their experiences with their friends using cell phones while spending time together. And participants reported a number of ways in which phone use threatened their positive faces, but they generally fell into these broad categories, right? So I'm not important enough to maintain my friend's attention, my friend is bored, and they don't take me or the relationship seriously. So if someone threatens your positive face, right, they're threatening that image that you want to convey. And in this case, that's the image of a good friend, right? An important and an interesting person. So there are some expectations for full attention, right? Attentiveness acted as a cue that the other person is important. And arguably, the underlying theme here is that the person being phubbed felt devalued. Participants also described cell phone use as rude and disrespectful, and that indicates that the phubber is bored with the conversation. And some participants mentioned the context in particular. So it's more threatening when the purpose of the interaction is to spend time together, as opposed to just like a quick informal chat or watching movies or something like that. And I always think of this scene from Gladiator when I talk about this because it's kind of like, I set aside time to hang out with you. The purpose of the hangout is to spend some quality time together. So, if you're on your phone, I just kind of want to ask, are you not entertained by this meeting? The researchers also found that participants spoke about negative face threats related to phubbing. So if someone threatens your negative face, recall that they are imposing on your time or they're interfering with your ability to do what you want to do. So participants reported 2 primary ways that phone use threatened their negative face. The first is that they felt it was unacceptable to tell their friends to stop using their phones even when they wanted to. And they felt that this would be perceived as overstepping their boundaries or intruding upon the other person. And this was described as being more appropriate in romantic relationships, um, and less appropriate in like big group settings, right? So you can't tell like a group of people not to use their phones. But you could probably tell one person, your romantic partner, like, hey, can you get off your phone for a sec? Participants also discussed feeling like they themselves couldn't use their own phones even though they wanted to because they were trying to be considerate of the other person's positive face. So even though I want to tell you to stop using your phone, I know I shouldn't because it's impolite. So I'm not going to do that. At the same time, I know I shouldn't use my phone because that will make you feel devalued. So even though I also want to use my phone, I'm not going to do that. So They avoided threatening their friend's positive face even when the act in doing so violated their own negative face, right? So again, we have this tension between positive and negative face needs, in particular when it comes to phone use among friends, at least in this study. All right, so what do we do to kind of manage and maintain our face needs during a given interaction? These are called face work strategies. So these are strategies that help you to maintain your face or to repair a face that has been threatened, or to strategically threaten your own or someone else's face, right? So sometimes you have to threaten your own or someone else's face, um, depending on what the situation is. Otherwise, right, how would you ever break up with someone? You have to engage in a face threatening act to do that, to end a relationship. So there are two dimensions to face work strategies. They are efficiency and politeness. And of course, there is a trade off between the two. So strategies that are most efficient are going to be less polite, and strategies that are more polite are going to be less efficient. So we have bald on record face work strategies. These are the most efficient and the most impolite. They are direct, ambiguous statements aimed at correcting the behavior. So we tend to use these kinds of strategies when efficiency is important, or if there is a larger power distance between us and the other person. So for example, parents and children are a great example of when you don't really care about being polite and you're just trying to be efficient, right? Come home right now. Your boss, so if you're an employee-employer relationship, your boss might have no problem telling you that your work is unacceptable and that you can't leave until it's finished or we won't meet the deadline, right? Emergency situations, we're really not concerned about being polite. We're concerned about being efficient. Going back to the cell phones that we just talked about, some of the participants said things like, okay, I'm going home because you haven't heard a single word I've said. So low politeness, but highly efficient. Positive politeness face work strategies address the receiver's positive face while still accomplishing the task, or redressing the behavior, right? So you recognize the receiver's value. So you are going to couch your face threatening act as something that doesn't threaten the identity of the other person. So essentially complimenting someone before asking them for something. So for example, I really want to focus on what you have to say. So let me just answer this call from my mom real quick and get that off my plate. So that's an example related to cell phone use. Another example related to something we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. Dear Professor, I really enjoy your class and have learned so much this semester. I even explained phubbing to my parents last night when we were having dinner. I was just hoping I could get an extension on, right? So you are validating the other person's identity and then imposing upon them. Negative politeness is when you address the receiver's negative face while accomplishing the task or redressing the behavior. Um, here you are trying to make sure that the other person does not feel coerced, but that they're performing the acts of their own volition, right? So phrasing in a way that a receiver can decline the request. For example, um, maybe related to cell phone use, maybe you don't want the other person to feel bad for using their phone. So you use your phone in response to not make it awkward. Or, dear professor, I know you are very busy and I apologize for emailing you on such short notice. I was wondering, right? So you acknowledge that um, you're probably not going to want to do the thing that I want you to do. Uh, and I acknowledge that. And you're welcome to say no. But here's the situation. Going off record is another strategy where you are prioritizing the face needs over actually accomplishing the task. So this is very polite, but it's not very efficient. It protects the face. So this includes indirect or ambiguous strategies like hinting or masking or like making it sound like the request you're making is just a joke. So in the cell phone study, participants would describe putting their phone away as a hint to the other person and would hope that that other person would catch on and put their phone away as well. And then finally, you could just decide not to engage in the face threatening act, but you will not accomplish your objective in getting the behavior to change, right? So let's say, for example, even though you don't like that your roommate is on their phone all the time, you may not say anything because you just don't want to upset them or embarrass them. So, most people perform some kind of quick cost benefit analysis when deciding which of those strategies to use in a given situation. And finally, we have corrective face work, which is when you engage in efforts to repair a damaged identity, right? So the face threatening act has already happened. What can you do now? And these can all be performed by the person whose face was violated, or by others trying to help protect the face needs of that person. Embarrassing moments are common situations in which you would engage in corrective face work because they undermine your positive face or your self image, right? Because they can be a sign of incompetence or ineffectiveness. So, avoidance is when you distance yourself or the other person from the act by basically pretending it never happened or by just ignoring it. And the hope here is that the audience pays less attention if you don't make a big deal out of it. So, if you are walking across campus and you trip, um, maybe you just keep on walking, right? And hope nobody noticed. You can also use humor. So, when the consequences of a face threatening act are relatively small, using humor actually shows poise and can come across as competent. So, you laugh at yourself so that others laugh with you, not at you. You can also apologize. When you apologize, you are admitting responsibility and you are ideally communicating regret. So, this is the opposite of avoidance because avoidance is kind of denying responsibility, whereas apologies tie the act to the actor and may actually further threaten the face. But apologizing also helps to correct that positive face or that positive image, right? So it's still kind of maintains that positive image that you have and hope to communicate that you're a good person if you're willing to own up to your mistakes. Accounts would be attempting to explain the face threatening act through excuses or justifications. So, an excuse would be trying to minimize responsibility. Oh, I wasn't really thinking about that. Or my friends pressured me, and so I just went along with what they were doing. Or a justification is when you reframe an event by downplaying the negative implications. Like, it's not that big of a deal, no one got hurt, right? Remediation is repairing physical damage. So, if you like spilled red wine on your friend's white carpet, you're going to clean up the spill and probably offer to pay for like additional cleaning. If your friend has something between their teeth, you say, hey, you got something between your teeth before someone else sees it, right? And you can also become aggressive. Obviously, this is probably not the best strategy, but you might repair damage by using physical force. So, starting a fight, for example, if someone insults you. You could use several of these in a single situation. So, you might apologize for the behavior, you might offer an excuse to help kind of explain the behavior, and then engage in some kind of remediation. So that is the end of part 2 of this unit. I know it was lengthy, but I hope that you enjoyed it because I do think talking about communicating identity is an important first step in understanding the rest of what we'll cover this semester because you kind of, I mean, that old saying is certainly true. You need to understand yourself and who you are before you can probably fully commit to a relationship with someone else. So I will see you again for lecture 3.